Tales from the Crypt by Jack Oleck. Narrated by Chris Harvey. He leaned out of the car with his eyes glaring. "You crazy fool! Do you want to get yourself killed?" The man was still shouting, his mouth wide open. It remained open while the anger in his face turned to a look of stark horror. It took only an instant. Maitland took a step forward. "Look, please!" The man shrieked. His mouth closed, opened, closed again. The mouth of a fish out of water. The sedan slammed into gear, leaped forward so suddenly and unexpectedly that a fender brushed Maitland's sleeve as it rushed by him. After a while, Maitland began to walk, following the sedan. "So that is why you are in a hurry." Maitland brushed a hand over his eyes. It seemed to him that he had been alone on a dark road. But that was impossible. He was still in the catacombs, still staring at the monk, and the monk was speaking slowly, ironically. "That is why you are in a hurry." "What do you mean?" He had to think, to clear his head. "To leave your wife? Your children?" No one knew about that. Only Susan. "How do you... Who are you? I assure you, I have a purpose." The monk did not seem to turn, yet somehow he was facing the young man who had sat close to Joanne. Younger than the others, still in his 20s, the young man had remained silent until now, almost arrogant despite his fear. But he could not keep that fear from sounding in his voice when he spoke. "What sort of game are you playing?" "Game? You're trying to frighten us in some way. What do you want?" "To show you something. Something in your own mind. Something that you're capable of doing." Circles of light. The monk's eyes were circles of light. "No, I don't want to know." There were pictures inside the circles now. "No." "Oh, but you must know." The pictures were growing clearer, clearer. "You must know." Had his chin been a trifle less weak and his mouth a trifle less petulant, James Elliot might have been a handsome young man. As it was, his face wore a perpetual expression of spitefulness. The expression varied only in degree, and at the moment it was quite intense. He had been aware of the noise, though not consciously, for some time. The magazine on his lap had been taking all of his attention, but it had recurred at intervals for an hour. Eventually it distracted him completely from his reading, so that he slapped the magazine down on a table and turned to the window behind him. The noise was a happy one, the sound of children's voices. A pleasant sound if one cared for such things. James did not. "Damned old nuisance." He stood up and walked to the window, almost as if to attack it. Beyond the window, the carefully tended expanse of Elliot lawn, green even now thanks to the wet English weather, extended broad and well kept to the street. Directly opposite, across the roadway, sat another house, considerably smaller than the one in which he stood. The door of the smaller house was open, and, despite the rapidly fading light, he could see a group of children struggling out onto the walk, each wrapped in heavy clothing against the December cold and each carrying a toy of some sort. One of the children turned to call back through the open door, and James could hear him clearly. "Thank you, Mr. Grimsdyke. Thank you, Mr. Grimsdyke. Thank you, Mr. Grimsdyke." James's mimicry was acid. "Brat." "Hey, what are you looking at?" His father had come into the living room from the study. Florid, monogrammed, and well-barbered, he was James as James would undoubtedly look in 30 years or so. Only his mouth was different. Where James's mouth was petulant, his was hard. Grimsdyke. His usual Christmas handout to the kids. James took his attention away from the window. I don't know how you stand it. What? Living across the road from that man. He's a rubbish collector. Those toys he gives to the kids are things he found in the trash and repaired. Why doesn't he sell out? An excellent idea. Why don't you ask him to do that? The elder Elliot could, when he chose, be as spiteful as James, but he was, in his way, fond of James, and the boy was only echoing his own sentiments. I've made him offers, but he's sentimental about the old dump. Says he and his wife lived there happily for their whole married life, and he wants to die there, just as they did. Almost he added, Amen. James renewed his stare through the window, his eyes venomous. Look at it. It ruins the neighbourhood, depreciates the value of our property, and the inside must be like a pigsty. The discussion was an old one. Elliot picked up the book for which he had come and turned to leave. He was proud of James. The boy was practical, aware of his position, ever alert to the hard cash value of things, but he had yet to learn that it was stupid to fight the inevitable. Look, he owns the house free and clear. There's nothing we can do. He was halfway out of the room before James spoke again, so that he did not hear James's last sentence. James was still staring across the street, but with a certain new intensity now, as though a thought had occurred to him. His eyes gleamed. Isn't there? On the far side of the road, another cluster of children was emerging from Mr. Grimsdyke's house. Their mittened hands waved cheerily back at Mr. Grimsdyke, hands that clutched a mended stuffed giraffe on wheels, a doll whose plastic head had been so skillfully repaired that the crack in it was hardly visible, a toy cart. A boy whose grin was the measure of his happiness and who pressed a small metal model of a robot to his breast lingered at the door long enough to repeat the words that had so annoyed James. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Grimsdyke." Mr. Grimsdyke beamed at him from where he sat. There were still half a dozen children clustered about him, but they were the last. He held up the small doll's cradle upon which he had been working, the better to examine it, and then set it upon his knee, and picked up a hammer and a tiny nail. A series of quick taps, and he had done. When he looked up, his smile and the apron he wore made him look remarkably like a little old gnome. The look suited him. It fitted his gentleness, the way his gaze rested fondly on the children. He handed the cradle to a little girl who stood waiting expectantly, only she was still empty-handed. "There. Thank you, Mr. Grimsdyke." How sweet she looked. So pleased. Surely children were God's own angels. "You're welcome. I'm glad you all liked the toys. I wish they were new, but I've done the best I can to fix them up." Mr. Grimsdyke's long-fingered craftsman's hand with the brown-edged spots on the back of it rested on the little girl's head like a benediction. "That's the last of them. Have a Merry Christmas." "Oh, we will, Mr. Grimsdyke." The girl ran to the door with her treasure, and the rest of the children followed. "A Merry Christmas, Mr. Grimsdyke. Thank you so much." "It's all right. I'll have more for you next year." Wishing that they would stay, Mr. Grimsdyke watched them go. A boy with tow-coloured hair spilling out from under his cap lingered in the doorway. "Can we come and watch you work sometime, Mr. Grimsdyke?" "Well, whenever you like. I'm always glad to have company." The boy vanished, but the echo of his voice hung in the room like smoke. Mr. Grimsdyke could hear the echo even after the door had closed. The sound of it set a little edge of sadness to his smile. He could not resist going to the door and looking after the children, but they were already far down the street, running past the Baker house with its tall white picket fence and its garden filled with rose bushes that each June flooded the street with their perfume. Mr. Grimsdyke sighed. Oh, if only Christmas could come every day. How wonderful that would be. The thought made his eyes mist. Until the children had rounded a corner, he remained where he was. Then, regretfully, he closed the door. When he emerged from the house a few moments later, he was wearing a worn coat and carrying a bucket. The bucket was heavy, and his strength was not what it had been, but he had long since become accustomed to aches and pains. There would have been no opportunity for him to dwell upon his pains anyway. His appearance was the signal for a sudden renewed outbreak of noise. In a moment he was surrounded by dogs in all sizes, shapes and colours. Mongrels, but mongrels that did not have the mongrel's usual frightened, wary look, whose ears did not droop timidly, who did not tuck their tails between their legs. These were animals that leaped and barked joyously as Mr. Grimsdyke emptied the bucket into a feeding trough and then stood back to watch them eat. Watching the dogs eat was one of Mr. Grimsdyke's few remaining pleasures. They had come to him from the streets slat-ribbed and starving, and the grateful soft eyes they turned upon him as they wolfed what he had provided was his reward. When the food was gone, they scampered about trustingly, vying with one another in their efforts to gain his attention, to lick his hand. It was dark when Mr. Grimsdyke returned to the house at last. Before he went in, he caught a glimpse of James still looking out of the window, still watching, but the sight of James meant nothing extraordinary to him. Mr. Grimsdyke sometimes regretted that James chose to be unfriendly, but he rarely wasted his thoughts on unpleasant things. There were so many other things to think about when one was old. When he had switched on a lamp, he sat for a long while staring at a framed photograph on a table. The photograph was of Martha, his wife. For an hour he thought an old man's thoughts about the happy past, until, in time, his memories became too poignant to bear. From a shelf stacked with books on spiritualism and the dead, he took an Ouija board with its pendulum suspended over it on a slim flexible rod of spring steel. For all his stiffness he moved quickly, eagerly as he set the board on the table under the lamp and then seated himself before it in the prescribed manner, not touching it. Concentrate. Mr. Grimsdyke's lips moved, repeating the word over and over again until it became a hypnotic drone. His eyes fixed on the Ouija board, took on a glaze. He was not in a trance, but neither was he in tune with the solid physical world around him, and it seemed to him that the flexible steel rod that supported the pendulum began to quiver. When he spoke again, his voice was almost imploring. "Darling, can you hear me?" No movement except for the slight quivering of the rod, no sound. Even the dogs, satiated and content, had found their beds for the night and were silent. Mr. Grimsdyke spoke very softly. Darling, are you there?" His worn face in the lamplight bore a look of ineffable tenderness. So slowly that it seemed hardly to move at all, the pendulum began to swing. The arcs it described were small at first, then wider and wider, until it had swung far enough to reach the word "yes" on the board. There it seemed to hang motionless for a breath, and then swung again in gradually narrowing arcs until it was still. "Is there anything you wish to tell me?" Mr. Grimsdyke's voice, like his face, was filled with love. He waited, intent on the pendulum. Will you give me your message?" The slim rod vibrated agitatedly, setting the pendulum into new motion. The pendulum swung faster this time, pausing for an instant now above one letter, now above another. D-A-N-G-E-R. Mr. Grimsdyke's eyes began to lose their glaze. Danger, danger, danger. To whom? Is it one of the children? To whom? Beside him, the bulb in the table lamp dimmed, brightened, dimmed once more, and then became bright again. The séance was over. Mr. Grimsdyke stared. His eyes were normal again, but they were worried. James had not noticed the dimming of the lamp through Mr. Grimsdyke's window. His stare, for the past few moments, had been fixed upon the Baker house, or rather on Mr. Baker's prize rose bushes. He could no longer really see the bushes. It was far too dark by now, but he could still visualize them. He moved away from the window nervously, thinking, after all, why not? Someone had to do something about old Grimsdyke. The spitefulness was clearly visible on his petulant mouth when he donned an old raincoat and left the house to walk to the tool shed. There he contemplated a spade, a rake, and a pitchfork. The pitchfork would be handiest. He took it from its pegs, touched the sharp points of the tines. Now that he had actually made up his mind, he was no longer nervous. He was, in fact, happy. The small in soul, anticipating the performance of some act of nastiness or cruelty, usually are. No one saw him cross the road. Thick clouds hid the moon. To him, the clouds were an indication of the rightness of what he was about to do. Even the night was on his side. He did not, however, go directly across the road. Instead, he crossed at an angle, so that his path took him to the Baker house, or more precisely, to the picket fence that surrounded the house and that protected the garden in which, during the growing season, Mr. Baker laboured so long and so lovingly. Gleefully but carefully, so as to make a minimum of noise, he kicked in a slat, then another and another, until there was an opening in the fence large enough to permit him to crawl through. His first thrust with the pitchfork lifted a rosebush from the wet earth and flung it across the fence. The earth was soft. Good. In 10 minutes he had uprooted the rose bushes and transformed the neatly laid-out garden into a shambles. Those bushes that came out of the soil intact he trod upon with his heel. The others, broken though they were, he mangled further with the pitchfork. Then, satisfied, he left the way he had come, pausing only long enough to search for any telltale marks that might have been left by the fork. There were none. He was chuckling when he returned to the Elliot living room, but the chuckle died in his throat. His father was sitting in the room, a copy of The Economist open in his hands. The sight of James in a dirty raincoat and carrying a pitchfork raised his eyebrows. James cursed inwardly. He had been stupid to bring the fork into the house, and more stupid still not to have noticed that there was a scrap of root wrapped around one of its tines. But his father's voice was not accusing. "Where have you been?" James smiled weakly. "In the garden, the one that belongs to Grimsdyke's neighbour." Elliot surveyed him with interest, then let his eyes rest on the pitchfork. "Baker's prize roses. He will be angry." "Well, someone had to." The elder Elliot did not let him finish. He had begun to understand, and it was all he could do to keep from duplicating James's smile. The boy had spunk. "Don't you think you ought to get out of that raincoat?" he said. Mr. Baker was angry in the morning. He was, in fact, in a cold rage. His garden looked as though it had been invaded by a pack of rooting pigs. Not a plant had been left undamaged, but the greatest damage was to his roses. Every bush had been destroyed, and broken canes and clumps of root were scattered everywhere. Mr. Baker, red and furious, turned on the constable who stood beside him, notebook in hand. Years! It took years of weeding, spraying, pruning, and in one night—" He could not go on. The constable shook his head commiseratingly. "It certainly is a pity." "A pity?" Mr. Baker's control of his vocal cords returned with a rush. "It was Grimsdyke's dogs." He forced himself to speak calmly. "I want to make a complaint." But Mr. Grimsdyke knew nothing of that. Mr. Grimsdyke went his quiet old man's way throughout the remainder of that day and the next. He had not forgotten the message that his Ouija board had spelled out, but he preferred not to dwell upon it. In Mr. Grimsdyke's world, danger was just a word. In Mr. Grimsdyke's world, there was no spite, no hate, and so how could there be danger? From what? From whom? He fed his dogs and strained his eyes over his books and dreamed of what used to be, and he was satisfied with what the good Lord had eked out to him. Unfortunately, it was men, not the good Lord, who were to alter the even course of his days and nights. On the third day, the constable arrived in front of Mr. Grimsdyke's house in a small van with wire-meshed sides and the word "Pound" painted across its tailgate. 2 policemen were with him. The legal-looking paper that the constable handed to Mr. Grimsdyke spelled out exactly what was taking place, but Mr. Grimsdyke did not at first comprehend what it meant. He could hardly read what it said. His spectacles had long since become inadequate to the task of effectively aiding his vision, and new ones were far beyond his means. "I'm afraid I've no choice," the constable said. "We'll have to take them. It's all there." Mr. Grimsdyke peered again at the paper. Most of it was in fine print. Still, by straining, he managed at last to understand what the print conveyed. "But, Behind him, the 2 policemen were rounding up the dogs. The dogs, accustomed to Mr. Grimsdyke's gentleness, made no effort to escape. They barked happily as the policemen tied ropes around their necks and led them to the van. "But you can't take them away. They're my friends." Poor old codger. The constable could feel for Mr. Grimsdyke, but he had his duty. "I'm sorry, that's a court order you're holding, and they don't have licenses." The dogs, penned behind the closed wire mesh doors of the van, had at last realized that something strange and frightening was happening. They whined anxiously as one of the policemen lifted the last of them into the van. The whine carried to Mr. Grimsdyke like a call for help. "Licenses? I couldn't afford." The mesh doors closed with a clang, and the whining of the dogs became a pleading whimper. Even the constable was affected by it. "I'm sorry," he said again, and wished that he could not see the stricken look in Mr. Grimsdyke's eyes, that there was some word of sympathy he could offer that would wipe the look away. But no mere words could have erased that look. Mr. Grimsdyke was still standing where the constable had left him when the van's motor roared to life and the van lurched away. The unexpected motion threw the dogs one against the other in a crazy tangle. When they had regained their feet, they pressed their muzzles against the wire mesh and renewed their barking. They could still see Mr. Grimsdyke, at least for a while, and it was as if they were saying goodbye. Mr. Grimsdyke remained rooted. He was crying when he finally turned and went into his house. He moved aimlessly, not certain what to do, touching things. There was comfort to be had from the possessions he had shared with Martha. That print on the wall, he could still recall the day they had bought it. That couch, how many evenings had they spent sitting there, not speaking? They had no need for words. Words. James was sick of words. Why was it that minor officials like Ramsay always talked interminably when what they had to say could almost invariably be said in a single sentence? Ramsay was only a councilman, but to hear him ramble on and on, one would have thought him to be a member of Parliament at the very least. "Very well, you don't like the idea. Your sympathy is commendable, but Grimsdyke still has to go." James made no attempt to conceal his annoyance. The Elliot family was the wealthiest and most important in town, paid the most taxes, and he was damned if he would stand for any more hesitation. "Well, how about it?" Ramsay did not relish what he had heard in the last few moments. "Grimsdyke's due to retire in a few years. He's done his job well. What you're asking, there's no reason for the town council to get rid of him. He's too old. The job needs a younger man." James narrowed his eyes as he had seen his father do when the elder Elliot wished to drive a point home. "Now, you see here, Ramsay, you know as well as I do that he's senile, and a nuisance to boot. That business with the dogs a few weeks ago, if they hadn't torn up Baker's roses and been done away with, they'd still be roaming the streets, endangering every man, woman and child in the neighbourhood. He's not to be trusted. He's no longer capable of thinking clearly. Why, he'd lose his retirement pay." Ramsay was still trying. He heard James with only a portion of his mind. The rest was recalling Grimsdyke in younger, better years. "And save the town some money." James came and stood over him. "My father and I," he accented the word father deliberately, "my father and I think that the council will be better off without him." It was a shame, it really was, but Ramsay had been too long acquainted with the Elliots' wealth and influence to ignore the implied threat. He felt small, contemptible, but he nodded. "All right, whatever you say." "Fine. I knew you'd see it our way." James stared at him coldly. When he stood up, Ramsay had an impulse to drive his fist against that spiteful, petulant mouth. Instead, he walked to the door. James saw him out. By the time he returned to the living room, his father had entered it, taken up a book and settled into a chair. He looked up only briefly when James came in. "Poor old Grimsdyke's out of a job," James said. For a moment his father's eyes reflected his own satisfaction. Then the elder Elliot grunted and went back to his reading. Mr. Ramsay told Mr. Grimsdyke the news 2 weeks later, after the council meeting to which Mr. Grimsdyke had not been asked. It was difficult, but it had to be done. "It was young Elliot," he finished. "Mr. Grimsdyke, what can I say? Most of the council members agreed with him." Of course I understand." Mr. Grimsdyke seemed to sag. Ramsay was afraid that he would fall. "Are you all right?" "All right. All right." Mr. Grimsdyke wanted to laugh. "All right. An old man with practically no savings, without income, with nothing to look forward to except emptiness. All right. Yes, I'm fine. I can see how it must have been. There was nothing you could do. You do understand, then. I appreciate that." Ramsay fiddled with his hat. "Well, good night, Mr. Grimsdyke." Mr. Grimsdyke waited for the door to close and then sat down heavily. He had been about to have his meagre dinner when Ramsay arrived and the food was still on the plate before him, but it did not tempt him. What little appetite he had was gone. He stared at the plate without seeing it, numbly aware of the silence that hemmed him in. His face had altered all in a moment, grown even older and more wrinkled, and his stooped shoulders had about them a new kind of stoop, the stoop of defeat. His hand shook when he at last lifted a bit of meat to his mouth. A scratching at the door distracted him. His hearing had been failing at an alarming rate, but there was no mistaking the sound or the scratching that followed it. Eagerly he went to the door. The small, fairy bit of life on the steps outside was wet and mud-caked, but it leapt up frantically at the sight of him, yapping a paroxysm of greeting, its tail wagging as if to snap it off. Mr. Grimsdyke's face lit up as if lighted from within. Of all his dogs, only this one had not been present on that heartbreaking day when the van had stopped at his house. Arms outstretched in welcome, he dropped to his knees, and the dog rushed to him to splash damp kisses on his face. Mr. Grimsdyke held the dog tightly, his arms wrapped protectively around it. "I wondered where you were," he said. I'm glad they didn't get you. You're my only friend now. You and the children." The children at least were something to which Mr. Grimsdyke could still cling in a world that he had always found to be a friendly place and that had now unaccountably turned against him. He could be seen on the streets much more frequently. He had redoubled his endless searching for salvageable toys, and the added effort required that he occasionally be away from his house for as much as half a day at a time. Previously, his longest journey had been only as far as the candy store, where it was his habit to purchase an assortment for the children. He still made that journey to the candy store once every 2 weeks or so, however, and if the few pennies he now spent there cut deeply into his already skeletal budget, only he was aware of the fact. He would not have wanted to disappoint the children. Despite his increasing long absences, the children were always there waiting when he returned, and their smiles were more than adequate recompense for the hunger pains that came to gnaw at his own vitals. But he never forgot that 7 and 8 and 9-year-olds are prone to overdo. At least once each day, as he handed out the candy, he could be heard to murmur, "Just 1 each for now, mustn't eat too many." Every so often he added a postscript, "Never had any when I was a boy." But the postscript was not added bitterly. It was because his own life had been so spare that Mr. Grimsdyke was so perfectly attuned to the children. He loved them. To lose the children would have been the bitterest blow of all. And of course he lost them. It was done quite simply without fuss. One afternoon James had a few of the neighbours in to tea. The women he invited were delighted. They accepted readily. After all, James was an Elliot, and came in their best dresses, plump, well-fed, comfortable young matrons who did not understand his unwanted friendliness, but they were flattered by it nonetheless. James poured. He did it well, handing around the delicate cups and the rich cakes on their fine platters with a flourish that the women found charming. Tea was consumed and the cakes eaten, and between nibbles James led the conversation expertly. The conversation predictably led at last to Mr. Grimsdyke. Mr. Grimsdyke, the ladies agreed, was a queer old duck. They chatted on about him at length, nibbling at the subject much as they nibbled at the cakes, until James thought the moment ripe. "He's a filthy old man," James said, "always going after those children." He paused, fixing a knowing eye on the ladies, and lowered his voice delicately. "Heaven knows what he wants." Mrs. Phelps said, "Oh!" Mrs. Carter said nothing, but there was sudden fear in her eyes. Mrs. Carter was the mother of the little girl to whom Mr. Grimsdyke had given the cradle. Mrs. Davis, whose son had tow hair and blue eyes, and whom she adored, saw in her head visions of newspaper headlines she had read that dealt with maniacal killers and perverts. It was not so much James's persuasiveness as their own apprehensions that made the ladies shudder, but James exploited those apprehensions with rare skill. Little things about Mr. Grimsdyke somehow took on new significance as the talk progressed. Long before the ladies gathered their things and left, they were, if not convinced that Mr. Grimsdyke was some sort of a monster, at least convinced that it was possible. Each of their faces when they returned to their own homes was grim. That same evening, Mrs. Phelps waited only until after dinner before taking herself upstairs to where her son lay on his bed, intent on a television movie about cowboys and Indians. Mrs. Phelps turned off the television set and launched at once into a lecture on the dangers that face children who are foolish enough to trust strangers, particularly when those strangers were nasty old men. Her son, in his child's way, attempted to protect Mr. Grimsdyke. "But he's not nasty, and he's not a stranger." Mrs. Phelps brushed that aside. She was steaming ahead under full power by then, and she was not to be denied. The ultimate gist of all that she had to say, however, was exceedingly simple, and there was, for a small boy, no defying it. "Just you remember, I don't want you to go near him." Mrs. Carter attacked the problem from another angle. Her lecture dealt primarily with the evils of germs. Her daughter was a most fastidious little girl, and Mrs. Carter, like most mothers, knew exactly what would be most likely to impress her. Even so, her daughter did not at once capitulate. The cradle that Mr. Grimsdyke had given her sat, even as her mother spoke, on a toy chest just across the room from her. There was a small doll in the cradle neatly tucked in, and she had only a little while earlier said good-night to the doll and informed it seriously how lucky it was to have so fine a bed. But there was no recourse from her mother's insistence. Her mother, still talking, bent to kiss her before leaving the room. "Mind now," she said, "you're not to take candy from him. Carrying rubbish all day, his hands must be filthy. Why, there's no telling what sort of horrible disease you might catch from him." Mrs. Davis was less subtle. She confronted her tow-headed son full on, spoke her piece and ended on a rising note. "You just stay away from him." "But—" "Don't argue with me. Just don't go near him. You or your friends." Thereafter, the children no longer came to Mr. Grimsdyke's house. At first there were times when he ran on shaking legs to the front door, alerted by the music of a child's laughter outside. But the children, when they saw him, seemed frightened. Some of them at the beginning hesitated when he came to the door, as though yearning to speak to him. But they were always gone by the time he came down the path, running down the street and hooting as children do when they are attempting to mask their own uncertainty. For the most part, however, they did not come near at all, and when enough time had passed, Mr. Grimsdyke began to give up hope. He still saw little knots of them on occasion, but his approach was invariably enough to send them scampering off in pursuit of some new game. Eventually, there was no more hope. Mr. Grimsdyke sat on a stool in his living room with his head bowed in despair. He had not bothered to turn on a light, and the room had about it a bleak loneliness that not even the mongrel at his feet could dispel. The mongrel, too, must have felt loneliness, because he stared and inched closer to Mr. Grimsdyke's feet, pressing against them as if to take comfort from the contact, his liquid eyes fixed on Mr. Grimsdyke's face. When the mongrel whined, Mr. Grimsdyke dropped a gnarled hand to pat it, and it shivered with ecstasy. But Mr. Grimsdyke was not really aware of the mongrel. Mr. Grimsdyke's larder was empty. His savings were gone. He was lost. "I can't understand it," he said. "Everyone was so friendly. The children—" The pain in his voice penetrated to the dog so that it whined the louder. Mr. Grimsdyke did not hear it. "The children," he said again. "Gone. Gone. Now I'm all alone. No work." His head lifted slowly. Mr. Grimsdyke was thinking. There were so many questions, but no answers. Across the road, James and his father had settled in for the evening. Dinner had been excellent, and they were at peace with the world. Few things are more satisfying than a good meal, particularly when the meal is accompanied by an excellent claret and topped off with a well-aged brandy. James had never felt better. Things were progressing swimmingly, and his petulant mouth, except for the slight smile that played around it, was for once at rest as he looked out of the living-room window. There had been no lights on in old Grimsdyke's house for half a dozen nights now, though he had occasionally seen the old man during the daytime. Before too long Mr. Grimsdyke would give up, and the neighbourhood would be rid of him. "Just one more turn of the screw," James said, and anticipation brought a return of the spitefulness to his lips. "One more turn, and he'll sell his property for next to nothing." His father poured himself some more brandy from the decanter on a sideboard. "Did you have anything particular in mind?" James grinned. "Valentine's Day. It's just 2 weeks away." "So?" The grin grew broader. "We'll send him valentines. From everyone in town." Valentines? Sometimes James made no sense at all. Elliot swirled the brandy in his glass, sniffed it, and waited. "Oh, you'll see." James's grin made him look rather like a wolf, his father thought. Whatever the boy had in mind, he did not envy Mr. Grimsdyke. As for Mr. Grimsdyke, desperation had wiped the last faint glow from his eyes, and loneliness had clamped him in a vice. His drive, his purpose was gone, and in its place there was an acceptance of what he could not change that had turned him into a parchment-thin ancient who wandered through his long days and endless nights like a wraith. Hunger was his constant companion these days, but it was not the hunger of the stomach that most tormented him. There was another hunger in him, a hunger for the sound of a voice, for the ripple of a child's laugh, for any contact that would make him feel that he was still a part of the human community. On St. Valentine's Day, when he heard a footstep on his garden path, he almost raced to the door, forgetting all at once that his body was one huge rheumatic ache. "The children?" It was the mailman. "Lots of mail for you today," he said. Mr. Grimsdyke rarely received mail, but on this day the mailman had a fistful of envelopes for him. Disappointment wiped the anticipatory smile from Mr. Grimsdyke's face. "That's strange. Nobody ever writes to me." His hands took the envelopes, turned them over and over. None carried a return address. I wonder who sent them." The mailman lifted a shoulder and walked away. Old Grimsdyke did not look at all well. Mr. Grimsdyke continued to turn the envelopes over and over in his hands. He was in no hurry. His life had become a dreary, interminable blank. So long as he put off opening the letters, he had something to which to look forward. The excitement mounted in him gradually. Who would be writing to him? He went back into the house, set the envelopes on a table, drew up a chair and seated himself, making a little ritual of it. Even then he did not open the envelopes. He waited until the excitement had set his fingers to quivering before tearing open the first one. There was a card inside, a card that bore on its face a red heart, and a black and white drawing of a skunk. Mr. Grimsdyke did not understand. Very carefully he set his spectacles on his nose and read the message printed below the drawing. The message wavered in front of him, but the type was fairly large so that he was able to puzzle it out. His eyes in the last month had grown rapidly weaker. "Noisy are children, loud is a bell, pungent is perfume, but you only smell." Mr. Grimsdyke looked puzzled. Opened another envelope. This envelope, too, contained a card. "A tree is beautiful if its owner prunes it, but our town isn't because your presence ruins it." Hastily now, Mr. Grimsdyke opened a third envelope and removed the card. "Some people live in the country. Some people live in the town. Why don't you do us a service? Jump in the river and—" Mr. Grimsdyke paled. The card slipped from his fingers and dropped onto the table with the others. "They wouldn't," he said. "The people in this town, they've always been so nice." But they had. Mr. Grimsdyke, never a large man, seemed to shrink and shrink. His head sunk on his neck, his shoulders slumped even further. His eyes, dumbfounded at first, took on an expression of pain impossible to endure. When his dog came to him and nudged his leg, understanding as dogs somehow do, he was too numb to pay attention to its plaintive whines. It was the whining of the dog, however, that eventually alerted James. For the next few days it was almost constant. Not that James suspected the truth, of course. Not at first. At first the whining was merely irritating, as the barking and the noises made by the children had been irritating. After several days he began to wonder. From his place by the window he voiced the thought to his father. "I haven't seen Grimsdyke for a week. Do you suppose anything's happened to him?" Elliot, too, looked through the window. So far as he could see, Mr. Grimsdyke's house seemed dead. The life that imbues houses in which people laugh and cry and love had left it. Elliot did not think of it just so poetically, of course, but the idea did pass fleetingly through his mind. "From the sound of that dog, it's possible. Just listen to him." The whining changed, became almost a howl, then reverted to a whine again. "Perhaps we'd better have a look," James said. "Yes, perhaps." Elliot was not particularly anxious to confront Mr. Grimsdyke, but the whining was a nuisance, and it was just possible that something had happened. "Let's go." They crossed the road together. James, in the lead, tried the door. "It's locked." Beyond the door, the whining continued. James twisted the doorknob pettishly. "You could call the constable." Elliot shook his head. "No, I don't think so. The old man may just be fast asleep. A fine pair of idiots we'd look then. We'd best handle this ourselves. That door lock doesn't look too strong. We can probably force it easily." He grinned, struck by a thought. Perhaps the old man is ill. After all, what are neighbours for? James grinned knowingly in return. Right. It required very little effort to force the door. The wood frame that surrounded it was old and dried out, like Mr. Grimsdyke himself. Where the latch fitted into its metal slot, the jamb splintered at once when James set his shoulders to the door. The door swung inwards on its hinges. James stepped through the doorway gingerly. He had often wondered what Mr. Grimsdyke's living room would be like. The picture in his mind had always been of a rabbit warren, a room crammed to bursting with stacks of old newspapers and other people's cast-offs and smelling of dust. The reality was quite different. The room was spotless. Even the books on the shelves were lined up precisely, and if there was a speck of dirt or dust anywhere, it was not visible. "Strange. I thought it would be filthy inside," James said. "I never expected it to be so clean." Elliot shrugged. "There doesn't seem to be anyone here. Where do you suppose the old man is?" "In there, probably." James nodded toward another door. The whining, temporarily silenced when they broke in, had begun again. It seemed to be coming from behind the door. "Well, we can soon find out." Elliot crossed to the door and opened it, but he did not go in. He could see everything that there was to be seen from where he stood. The dog was sitting on its haunches in the middle of the room. It did not turn toward them. Its head was cocked and it was looking upward at something. Mr. Grimsdyke was hanging from a chandelier, suspended by the neck from a rope in which he had knotted a noose. His face was mottled with purple, and his tongue had been forced out of his gaping mouth. It protruded almost comically, like the tongue of a clown, or like the tongue drawn on a funny face on a Valentine's Day card. The town turned out in force for the funeral, of course. They were all there. Mr. and Mrs. Phelps, Mr. and Mrs. Davis, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, Mr. Ramsay. They came and stood in the churchyard as the coffin containing Mr. Grimsdyke was lowered into the ground, and they were all properly sad. They did not wear mourning. That would have been overdoing things a bit. Nor did it strike them that Mr. Grimsdyke's grave was in a far, ill-kempt corner of the churchyard, but they came and listened dutifully as the vicar intoned the burial service. Even after the vicar had finished his reading, they lingered. It was only good manners. It would have been unseemly to hasten away. But there was really very little reason for lingering. When they had stayed for what they judged to be an appropriate length of time, they began to drift toward the churchyard gate, holding their children by the hand. The vicar gravitated naturally to where James and his father, the last to go, still stood by the open grave. "It was kind of you to pay for the funeral," the vicar said. Elliot accepted the compliment gracefully. It did not occur to him when he spoke that he was echoing the words he had spoken outside Mr. Grimsdyke's door. It was the least we could do. He was a neighbour. "Well, good day to you. Good day." The open grave was depressing. Elliot turned away from it with a grimace. "We may as well leave too." He and James followed the others. No one looked back, except the children. In his grave, after it had been filled in, Mr. Grimsdyke slept. He lay with his arms folded across his chest and his old face still, and little by little, as the days passed, the juices in his body began to ferment. The juices bubbled silently and then gave way to a host of maggots, and the flesh of Mr. Grimsdyke's face rotted away a bit at a time until what was left of his cheeks and his mouth clung only in patches to the bare skull beneath. His fingers became claws on which, oddly, the fingernails continued to grow, and his arms became mere sticks of bone under disintegrating cloth. Inexorably the seasons progressed. Hot sun baked the earth heaped in a mound above Mr. Grimsdyke's grave, and pelting storms washed it away, flattened it so that it became difficult, unless one knew where to look, to be certain just where Mr. Grimsdyke had been laid to rest. Snow made a white mantle that the wind whipped into fanciful swells and patterns to take the place of the flowers that no one thought to bring. Cold bit into the ground and turned it to marble that softened and became friable again as the rains of early February made their entrance. Mr. Grimsdyke no longer looked like a little old gnome by then, but there was no one to see, no one to care. He no longer had any claim, not even a tenuous one, on the cosy homes that still shed their bright lights on the streets where he had walked. He no longer had any interest in the people inside those homes who ate their meals and joked and argued as though he had never been. Mr. Grimsdyke slept, and it was as if he waited. 3 squares away, the Elliot house too shed its warm glow on the street outside. The living room was brightly lighted. James was writing a letter, and he liked a bright light when he wrote, but he was annoyed. He had come to the end of one sheet of writing paper, and there were no others on his desk. One by one he pulled open the drawers of the desk and searched inside them without success. There was no paper in any of the drawers, but in one there was a small stack of Valentine cards. He had forgotten that the cards were there, and when he took them from the drawer his hand trembled slightly. When he did not move for a long time, his father, reading in a chair at the far side of the room, looked up. "Is something wrong, James? What is it?" "Valentine cards, left over from last year, when we—" James broke off to look at the calendar on the desk. "It's exactly a year." Today is St. Valentine's Day. It was a year ago exactly that we—" "Not thinking about old Grimsdyke, are you?" No, of course not. Why would I?" His father was no longer interested. James considered the cards thoughtfully. Not that it could ever possibly lead to anything, but the cards were evidence of a sort. He tore them in half, in quarters, then crossed to the fireplace and tossed the pieces into the flames. They caught, flared briefly, and collapsed into black ashes. As black as the sodden earth above Mr. Grimsdyke's grave. It had been raining again, and the crude new headstone that identified his last resting place glistened and ran with moisture. The rain had stopped now, but it had left the earth muddy and soft. A tiny rivulet of water ran down the headstone and along the spongy soil, and where it ran, something began to happen. The earth seemed to pull away on either side of the rivulet, to make a crack. The crack spread, ran the length of the grave, and a hand came out of it. A fetid, impossible hand with long, sharp fingernails trailing bits of dead flesh. The hand moved convulsively as though straining. Then another hand broke through the crack, a nauseating claw that stank of death. James paused in his writing. He had finally found a supply of writing paper, but something had disturbed him. Despite the logs blazing in the fireplace, there was a chill in the room. He shivered and went back to his writing. The crack was even wider now. The ground around it heaved sluggishly, as though something were pressing upward from below. There seemed to be a struggle taking place beneath the surface. The ground broke open and a rotting corpse rose from the opening, swaying uncertainly. The hand that the corpse placed on the headstone for support dripped clots of mud and skin. Elliot closed his book with a snap. He was tired. "Coming upstairs?" "In a moment. I've almost finished." Elliot stood up and stretched, yawning. "I'm going to bed. See you in the morning." James nodded. Mr. Grimsdyke nodded too. His skull-like head swayed on his shoulders, and he still clung to the headstone. His long hooked fingernails grated on the stone when he took the hand away and began to cross the churchyard. James had just finished his letter when the door behind him burst open. Mr. Grimsdyke moved toward him with his hands at the ends of his stick-like arms held out so that every detail of their decomposing fingers and razor-sharp talons impressed itself into his brain. Mr. Grimsdyke's teeth, stripped of their lips, gleamed in the firelight. There was no screaming. The rotten corpse moved with incredible swiftness. The bony fingers closed about James's throat, choking off his disbelieving shriek of terror before he could utter it. The rest was done in silence. Only the crackling fire was witness to it. The fire burned on, burned itself out, and then there was not even the sound of its crackling. There were only ashes in the fireplace when Elliot came to the room in the morning. He had only a moment before found James's bed unmade and unslept in, and he was a bit apprehensive. He opened the living-room door, called, "James?" and then choked. His face went white and shock dropped his jaw open. James was lying on his back on the floor with his eyes wide open, and James was an island in a sea of blood. Near him, beyond the blood, lay a sheet of writing paper, but Elliot did not at first see the writing paper. He was staring in horror at James. Someone had torn the clothing away from James's chest, and there was a gash in the flesh beneath like an open, oozing mouth. Elliot tore his eyes away. Almost hysterical, he sought for and found an anchor, something to do that would keep him from losing his sanity. His eyes fell on the sheet of paper lying near James's body. There was writing on it, a shaky, almost illegible scrawl. The paper was dirty, streaked with dried mud, but the writing was clearly visible. He bent over it, not daring to touch it. At the top, the shaky handwriting spelled out, "Happy Valentine's Day." The rest was in verse. Elliot's mouth moved unconsciously as he read it. "You were mean and cruel right from the start. Now you really have no—" He did not read the last word. Slowly, not wanting to, he reached for the paper, lifted it up. There was something under it. But he really did not need to lift the paper to know what he would find. There was a fog in James's mind. It wound tendrils of fear about his thoughts, made his sight blur. The fog cleared. His petulant mouth quivered. "It's true. I don't like Grimsdyke, but—" The last was an unvoiced question. He wanted to shout, "How do you know?" and could not. His mouth opened and closed convulsively, silently. "What did you see?" Rogers was staring at him. But it was the monk who answered. "What's more important is what you will see." Rogers too wanted to shout. Instead he fought calm into his voice. "Look, who are you?" No answer. "What do you want with us?" The monk spoke very slowly, as if to accent the importance of his words. To warn you of what may happen if—" "We're not interested in any warnings." Rogers had had enough. "All we want to do is to get out of here." "Very well." For a long moment the glowing eyes regarded him impassively. Then the monk turned to the stone door by which he had made his appearance. The door stirred, swung outward as the monk turned again to face Rogers. The door had to be a way out, an escape. Rogers took a step toward it and hesitated. A premonition, an instinct, was shrieking in his head, but he was no longer moving of his own volition. Some power that he could not comprehend propelled him toward the door and made him look in. He was staggering, a grimace of horror frozen on his face when he turned away. Jason started up from his seat. "What did you see?" "Tell him." The monk spoke quietly without inflection. Rogers shook his head, dumb. "Then you tell me." Jason turned on the monk almost savagely, shouting. but he heard his own voice only faintly as the monk's eyes focused on his. He had only time for a few more words before he lost the will to speak. "Well, at least tell me why I'm here. Why did I come?" He spoke the words, and then the monk and the chamber were gone. He was in another room. A familiar room. James Elliot's story, Poetic Justice, was written by Jack Oleck and narrated and sound edited and mixed by Chris Harvey. Coming soon, stay tuned for even more Tales from the Crypt, when I will be bringing you Ralph Jason's fateful story, Wish You Were Here.